Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 840, and today is September 25th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Lots of news to talk about today. It's been a busy week, a lot of news happening in New York City with the UN General Assembly. I want to cover a lot of that on today's show. First, need to mention the sponsor of today's episode, and that is the Expat Money Summit 2025. This is a fantastic annual online event that's put on by Mikhail Thorup, the host of the Expat Money Show. I've been on Mikhail's show before. Fantastic guy, smart guy, really cares about, the issues that we talk about on this show. And what Mikhail does with the Expat Money Summit is he helps people to figure out if they want to live abroad, if they want to craft a plan B, how to do that. We've seen news stories in the U.S. recently, like the Congress is trying to give Marco Rubio the power to revoke Americans' visas. And so if you did want to get a second passport from another country, how would you go about doing that? If you did move abroad, what does your tax situation look like? And what foreign countries can you even own land in? All those questions and more will be answered at the Expat Money Summit 2025. The event is coming up middle of next month, October 10th through the 12th. So be sure to head on over to expatmoneysummit.com and reserve your free ticket to the event. You could go get a free ticket, attend any of the regular conferences, talks they have at that event. No charges. Now, if you want a VIP ticket, and I will be on one of the VIP panels for the event alongside Dave DeCamp, my coworker at antiwar.com, you could get that ticket at a discount, 20% off when you use the promo code Kyle when you check out. Again, that's Kyle, Kyle, when you check out. And the website is expatmoneysummit.com. All right, everybody. Want to get into the show today? Just remind people I write for a lot of different outlets. The best way to follow all my work is by following me on X at Kyle Anzalone_. You get Conflicts of Interest, the Kyle Anzalone Show, the articles I write for antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, and JudgeNap.com. We'll start off here with this article I wrote for JudgeNap.com. Maduro sent letter to Trump, or this one's from the Libertarian Institute, published on September 22nd. Maduro sent letter to Trump offering talks to prevent conflict. A top Venezuelan official confirmed that President Nicolas Maduro sent a letter to President Trump earlier this month that was offering talks to prevent the war. So the letter was published on Vice President Delcy Rodriguez's Telegram account on Monday and dated September 5th. Maduro says in the letter that Trump has been led to believe fake news about Venezuela's ties to drug trafficking and Caracas's willingness to work with the Trump administration on returning Venezuelan migrants from the U.S. The letter includes a map from a UN study that shows 87% of drugs from South America are trafficked to the western U.S. via the Pacific Ocean. Only 7% of South American drugs make it into the U.S. via the Caribbean. And of course, Venezuela has a Caribbean coastline, not a Pacific coastline. And so this means countries like Peru, Ecuador, Colombia are generally responsible for most of the drugs coming from South America making it to the U.S. Another important part of all of this, and I don't believe this was mentioned in the letter, but I do think it's important for my audience to understand. When Trump is talking about drug deaths in the United States, most of that is coming through heroin, fentanyl, which does not come from Venezuela. That is mixed in Mexico. And so, again, this really isn't helping solve the crises that the Trump administration is asserting that it is. So, the letter concludes with Maduro offering to engage in direct talks with Trump's envoy, Richard Grenell. In February, Grenell traveled to Venezuela and secured the release of 6 American prisoners after meeting with Maduro. Following the meeting with Grenell, Secretary of State Marco Rubio began ramping up sanctions on Venezuela and seized Maduro's plane. In July, the State Department designated 2 Venezuelan cartels as narco-terrorist organizations. Trump has authorized military actions against designated narco-terrorist organizations. Trump and Rubio have claimed that Maduro is leading multiple narco-terrorist cartels and have offered a $50 million bounty on the Venezuelan president. The U.S. intelligence community assesses that Maduro is not the leader of TDA, one of the listed cartels. And then Washington also accuses Maduro of leading the Cartel of the Suns, or Cartel de los Soles. However, U.S.-funded NGO has said there is little evidence that the Venezuelan government is the leader of that gang. And so, again, there's really no evidence for the claim that Maduro is the leader of one of these cartels, narco-terrorist cartels, that are trafficking drugs into the U.S. The letter from Maduro was sent to Trump in the days following a U.S. strike on a ship in the Caribbean that had left from Venezuela. The president claimed that 11 members of a narco-terrorist cartel were killed in that attack, but has not offered evidence to bat that assertion. There are other reports that the people killed were not members of a cartel, but rather fishermen. The U.S. has conducted 2 attacks on ships in the Caribbean after the letter to Trump was delivered. In the post included the letter, Rodriguez said, "The military threat against Venezuela, the Caribbean, and South America must cease, and the proclamation of a zone of peace must be respected." And so, I think it's interesting that Venezuela seems to be willing to deal with the U.S. here. It's not as if the Venezuelan government is saying that, oh, that we're going to war now. There's nothing that could be resolved here. They're saying, no, send Rick Grinnell. Let's talk. Let's work through this. And it seems that the Trump administration is just not willing to do that. As we had this article written by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on September 22nd, U.S. official says regime change in Venezuela is the real goal of military action in the Caribbean. So U.S. officials have told the New York Times that the real goal of the U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean and the bombing of boats in the region is regime change in Venezuela. The policy is largely being driven by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who has long wanted to remove Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from power. Back in 2019, when the first Trump administration attempted to back a coup against Maduro, Rubio posted a video on Twitter of former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi in the moment he was being brutally murdered in an apparent threat to the Venezuelan leader. The Trump administration claims Maduro is the leader of a drug cartel, but of course, that's just the pretext for regime change. And for listeners of this show, longtime listeners of this show, you'll know that even before Trump took office, when he named Marco Rubio the Secretary of State, I said the good of this is maybe that Rubio is just so stupid, so incompetent that Trump cast him aside, and he relies on Rick Grinnell and Steve Witkoff to essentially act as his Secretary of State. This hasn't happened. Rubio has gotten more power. He's also now the National Security Director, or at least is in that role in the interim. And I said the worst thing that could happen is if Marco Rubio made Secretary of State was that he would be essentially put in charge of the Latin America portfolio, where he is one of the most notorious hots on that issue. All right. Moving on here, this article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on September 23rd. Trump, Ukraine is in a position to win all of Ukraine back, some of Russia. This is absolutely insane. President Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that Ukraine is in a position to win the war and that the Russian economy is in trouble. So Trump wrote on Truth Social, after getting to know and fully understand the Ukraine-Russia military and the economic situation, after seeing the economic trouble it is causing Russia, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. With some time, patience, and financial support from Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where the war started is very much an option. So Trump said that it's possible for Ukraine to even take some Russian territory before the war ends. The president wrote, Ukraine would be able to take back their country in its original form, and who knows, maybe even go further than that. And so in the first part of this post, he says the original borders from where the war started, and who knows exactly what he thinks that means. It certainly has some maybe different interpretations. Before the war started, the Donbass was in open rebellion to Kiev and was effectively independent and relied on Russia to maintain that independence. And so if Trump is maybe just talking about Ukraine taking back Zaporizhia and Kherson, I mean, as absurd as that is, and as I don't think that's even possible to happen, at least that is more realistic. But in the second part, he says the country in its original form, which means not only the Donbass, but also the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed in 2014. Now, Putin has made very clear that he will defend Crimea as if it's any other Russian territory, which I assume would mean that he would be willing to use strategic weapons and even if that wasn't his initial response and would, ramp up and would, commit terrible war crimes, carpet bombing of Ukrainian cities, decapitation strikes against the Ukrainian government, maybe strikes on border areas to try to prevent any Western weapons from ending Ukraine. Like, I do think all these things are very possible that Russia would do before escalating to nuclear weapons. However, if Moscow was on the brink of losing the Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine, I do think we would see Moscow deploy strategic weapons before they let that happen. So the president argued that Moscow's military is and this is his term, paper tiger, and that the Russian economy is struggling. So he wrote on Truth Social, Russia has been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years, a war that should have been taken a real military power less than a week to win. This is not distinguishing Russia. In fact, it is very much making them look like a paper tiger. Putin and Russia are in big economic trouble, and this is the time for Ukraine to act. Now, again, I don't think Trump just really understands the actual way that this war has played out. I do think there is some real fair criticism that you can make of Russia and the way that they handled this war, particularly in the opening phase. And for people who predicted that Russia would dominate Ukraine, that obviously hasn't happened. However, after this war has kind of settled in, it's clear that Russia has developed a winning strategy, and I think is kind of based upon not spending too much money or manpower on this war and just, basically fighting not to rapidly take territory, but to weaken and ultimately reduce Ukraine to a rump state. And so at this point, I think Russia is willing to fight until the Ukrainian military collapses, and that will happen at some point. Now, one of the things I think left out in Trump's post that I'm not sure if the president doesn't understand or just is maybe bluffing with all of this is how Ukraine is possibly going to do this. I think the biggest issue, and maybe this is even now a more pressing issue than the manpower issue, is the financial shortfall that Ukraine is going to face next year. Kiev says they will need about 120 billion to finance its war machine next year, and Ukraine can only allocate 60 billion to the war budget. Now, Trump restated in that post that the Europeans are going to be funding this war. Well, NATO members have only pledged to buy 2 billion in arms for Kiev from the U.S. for this coming year, and so there's obviously a massive financial shortfall if the U.S. isn't going to step up and provide Ukraine weapons. Now, Trump had another problematic statement at the United Nations. This is when he was sitting down at a press conference with Zelensky on Tuesday, and he said that NATO should shoot down Russian aircraft that enter alliance airspace. Originally, this article I wrote for the Institute was kind of detailing how NATO was saying that they were willing and may shoot down Russian aircraft that entered Allied airspace. They called a Article 4 meeting after a Russian aircraft violated Estonian airspace. Russia denies that. Estonia claims Russia flew apart the very northern tip of their airspace for about 20 minutes. This was over the Gulf of Finland and was escorted out of Estonian airspace by F-35s, NATO F-35s operated by Italy. So, but Trump's statements were obviously very provocative and problematic. Now, last night I found this article at the Washington Post that I wrote up, where White House officials are telling the Post that Trump isn't serious about the threats, he's not changing policy in any way, and that this is all a negotiating tactic. So I write, President Donald Trump recent claims that Russia is a paper tiger and that Ukraine could win the war are meant as a negotiating tactic and intended to pressure Russian President Vladimir Putin. A White House official explained to the Washington Post that the rhetoric did not represent a change in U.S. policy towards Ukraine. So, let's see. A White House official attempted to downplay Trump's statement on Wednesday that we covered about the shooting down the planes and the paper tiger. The senior administration source said that the president's rhetoric was a negotiation tactic and reflected Trump's increasing frustration with Putin. The source said Trump has been very frustrated with Putin for a long time. He's sending a very strong message. Russia is and a massive country with a massive economy. They have a war economy, and Ukraine has still been able to defend itself for nearly 4 years. He's saying, look, if Putin doesn't want peace, let's continue fighting, and we're going to continue to sell weapons to NATO. The official added that Trump's regressive remarks did not mean that the administration was considering changing the White House's Ukraine policy. And so if the White House's Ukraine policy isn't going to change, if the U.S. isn't going to start paying for and sending military aid to Ukraine, then I really think that this is just bluffing, and the Russians will understand that this is bluffing. One more story on Ukraine here. This comes from our friend Dave DeCamp over at antiwar.com, published on September 24th. Report, Trump was made aware of Ukrainian counteroffensive plan that requires U.S. intelligence support. So, the president was made aware of a planned Ukrainian counteroffensive that requires U.S. intelligence support before he posted a long statement on Truth Social where he insisted Ukraine could retake all of the territory Russia captured since 2022 and maybe even able to go further. U.S. officials told the Wall Street Journal that the president made the post after spending time with his special envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, Mike Waltz, and his former national security who is his former national security advisor and is now the U.S. ambassador to the UN. Kellogg said the U.S. could kick Russia's ass and insisted that Ukraine could win the war despite Russia's continued gains in eastern Ukraine and its clear advantage with manpower and industrial capacity. So this is, I think, really interesting that Trump would make this post right after learning about that. You think there maybe be some operational concerns there, like he's maybe telegraphing Ukraine's attack just a little bit too much. But I also think this is an important insight. And actually, Andrew Day talked about this on my show, the Kyle Anzalone show yesterday. I interviewed him. He was one of the senior editors over at the American Conservative. And he said, this really reflects that Trump is so swayed by the last person he talks to. And you have to worry when it seems Rubio, Kellogg, Waltz, still Hegseth, all are people really with the president's ear. And it doesn't seem maybe he's listening so much to the more reasonable people in his administration, Vance, Witkoff, and Tulsi Gabbard on this issue. All right. Next up here, switching over to Israel-related stories. This first one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on September 22nd. U.S. prepares to sanction ICC in retaliation for investigation into Israel's genocide in Gaza. The Donald Trump administration could impose sanctions on the entire International Criminal Court. The move is a response to the ICC's investigation into Israeli war crimes in Gaza that have led to an arrest warrant for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Reuters reports speaking with six sources who claim that the White House is discussing expanding sanctions on the ICC to include the entire entity. The move could impact the day-to-day operations at The Hague, such as the court's ability to pay its staff. The sanctions are a response to the ICC's investigation into the Israeli onslaught in Gaza that has led to the arrest warrant for Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. A spokesperson for the State Department told the outlet that the sanctions will be imposed unless the ICC undergoes reforms. The ICC has the opportunity to change the course by making critical and appropriate structural changes. The U.S. will take additional steps to protect our brave service members and others as long as the ICC continues to present a threat to our national interest. The U.S. has a history of targeting the ICC for its investigation into war crimes committed by the U.S. and Israel. In 2002, the U.S. adopted the Hague Invasion Act, which allows for the president to deploy forces to free American or allied citizens arrested by the ICC. The U.S. and Israel have not signed the charter that formed the ICC and argue that Americans and Israelis who commit war crimes should not be subjected to the Hague's jurisdiction. However, President Joe Biden worked with the court in an effort to prosecute Russian President Vladimir Putin. Moscow is also not a member of the ICC. During Trump's first administration, he blacklisted ICC prosecutors investigating Israel and U.S. war crimes committed in Afghanistan. Some members of the ICC plan to lobby Trump against sanctioning the court at this week's UN summit. So again, just so many things done to protect Israel that are not in the benefit of the United States of America. Next up here, this article I wrote on September 23rd at the Libertarian Institute. Israel expanding support of anti-Hamas militia in Gaza, including ISIS-linked groups. So Israeli forces are supporting armed Palestinian groups that are opposed to Hamas. The groups have established 2 areas outside of Hamas's control. One of the militias, Abu Shabab, is tied to the Islamic State. A new Palestinian armed militia, Strike Force Against Terror, announced it's prepared for 300 to 400 people to live in a neighborhood of Khan Yunis under its control. Israel helps us expand. The goal is the same, that people live under our protection in an agreement with our neighbors, a commander in the militia explained. Hassam al-Astal, the leader of Strike Force Against Terror, or SFAT, said his group was committed to keeping Hamas from having a presence in the camp. He told the Times of Israel, "Whoever lives under Hamas's oppression, come to us." He said his neighborhood is currently powered with solar panels, but soon Israel will soon allow electricity and water into the camp. Most Palestinians in Gaza do not have access to power and clean water. The SFAT-run neighborhood is the second Palestinian militia to establish control over a region with the assistance of Israel. Yasser Abu Shabab, the leader of the Popular Forces, which is also just called Abu Shabab, controls an area of Rafah. In June, former Defense Minister Lieberman accused Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of arming Shabab's group and that it was linked to ISIS. The Israeli leader confirmed that the IDF was supporting the ISIS-linked group, but argued that the policy would save the lives of Israeli soldiers. Some high-ranking members of Abu Shabab gang have also been accused of fighting alongside ISIS, such as Assam Nabin, who has been alleged to have been active in the infamous terror group in the Sinai before returning to Gaza. According to Ynet, the group's deputy leader was involved in the 2006 abduction of an IDF soldier and is the brother of an ISIS operative killed by Hamas. A senior leader of the Popular Forces told the Times of Israel that SFAT is part of the same organization and is attempting to set up a continuous belt stretching from the neighborhood in Khan Yunis to the neighborhood in Rafah. "We are all one," the commander said. So the U.S. through Israel is supporting the Islamic State once again. See, this really isn't about Americans, our national security, because if it was, the one people in the world we would not be aligning ourselves with is Al-Qaeda. But we have seen that happen time and time again when it benefits and works with Israel's policy. Next up here, Israel destroys medical center in Gaza City. An Israeli bomb leveled a 6-story medical facility in Gaza City on Tuesday. According to the Palestinian Medical Relief Society, its medical center was destroyed after Israel ordered its evacuation. PMRS is a Christian aid organization. So this is quote from a PMRS staffer who was at the clinic when the evacuation order was issued. It all happened so suddenly. We all heard a commotion in the street, and then someone came and told us they were planning to strike the building and the entire block. They gave us 30 minutes to evacuate. Everyone rushed out, and about a half hour later, they hit the building. The whole tower came down, and even the entire block suffered massive destruction. Before the building was destroyed, 1,000 people were treated each day at the medical center. It was one of the main blood donation centers in the Strip as well. The IDF did not comment on the strike. Israel has damaged or destroyed nearly all the hospitals and medical facilities in Gaza. Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis is the only fully functioning hospital in the Strip. Remember, there's 2 million people in this Strip. So, I mean, you can imagine if there was like a U.S. city had 2 million people and only a single hospital, the chaos and the cries and the demands for more medical facilities that would come if that was the situation. And you know, a USA that's not even a war zone, just, you know, dealing with heart attacks and all other kinds of medical illnesses, cancer treatments, and then, of course, treated the wounding people from the wars and things like that. So the PMRS said that the attacks were also a part of the systematic campaign against the healthcare system in Gaza. This is what the statement from the organization said. The latest destruction is part of a wider pattern. In the last 3 weeks alone, 3 of our clinics have been targeted and destroyed, with one partially damaged, 2 of the others destroyed. The statement says these deliberate attacks are systematically dismantling what little remains of Gaza's healthcare infrastructure and shows Israel's total disregard for the international community and the humanitarian principles that our international partners stand for. UN experts have previously said Israel was committing medicide, or the deliberate destruction of the medical infrastructure in Gaza. A Christian aid official said Israeli attacks are preventing medical care in Gaza. So Katie Roxborough, Christian Aid's program manager for Gaza, said, our partners' life-saving work in Gaza is being consistently degraded by the Israeli military. 2 weeks ago, it was our partner PCHR, that's the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, I believe. Their office was destroyed in Gaza City. It is hard to find the words when almost every day for nearly 2 years there is a new horror. This horror, there was a clinic. It should be a safe place where people can come for help. Instead, they came and were bombed. The IDF is ravaging Gaza City with an intense bombing campaign and ground invasion. Israel has ordered the evacuation of the 1 million Palestinians living in the area. At least 500,000 people remain in the city. I believe the IDF is kind of estimating lower numbers remain in the city. It probably means less international pressure. There's 800,000 people still in the city. It's pretty horrific that they're carrying a massive bombing campaign. I mean, 500,000 people as well. But if that number is almost double, and Palestinian sources have put that number much higher, then that certainly means a lot more civilians are being killed in all the destruction and chaos. Next up here, this article I wrote for JudgeNap.com on September 23rd. Israel closes only West Bank crossing with Jordan. Tel Aviv has further isolated Palestinians in the West Bank by closing the enclave's only border crossing with Jordan. The border crossing is a crucial lifeline for Gaza. On Tuesday, Israel announced the complete closure without a timeline for reopening the Albany Bridge crossing, which is also known as the King Hussein Bridge. Last week, a Jordanian aid truck driver opened fire on Israeli soldiers manning the checkpoint, killing 2. The crossing is key for aid getting from warehouses in Jordan to Gaza. The near total Israeli siege of Gaza has led to starvation deaths of hundreds of Palestinians, and hundreds of thousands are now facing famine. While Israel has conducted a genocidal onslaught in Gaza, it has also ramped up military operations in the West Bank. About 1,000 Palestinians, including 200 children, have been killed by the IDF and Israeli settlers in the West Bank since October 7, 2023. Additionally, tens of thousands of Palestinians have been driven out of their homes. The IDF has conducted home demolitions in the West Bank, with some high-ranking Israeli officials calling for the operations to mirror the destruction in Gaza. Tel Aviv's decision to close the border comes as it is moving closer to annexing portions of the Palestinian territory. All right, this one, I got one or two more stories here dealing with Gaza. This one deals with both the Gaza and the West Bank. And I wrote it at the Libertarian Institute on September 24th. UN report, Israel committing genocide in Gaza sees Jewish majority in the West Bank. The UN Commission of Inquiry conducted an investigation and concluded that Israel was trying to eliminate the Palestinian life in Gaza and establish a Jewish majority in the West Bank. Top Israeli officials have called for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and the annexation of the West Bank. So this is a portion of the UN report. The Israeli officials have demonstrated a clear and consistent intent to establish permanent military control over Gaza and change its demographic composition while systematically destroying Palestinian life in Gaza. This is evident in the extensive destruction and fragmentation of the territory, the establishment of military structures, the destruction of natural resources and infrastructure essential to the survival of the civilian population, forcible transfer, and statements indicating the existence of plans for the deportation of the population. Following the Hamas attack in October 2023, Israel launched a brutal onslaught in Gaza and besieged the Strip. Israel has killed at least 65,000 Palestinians, although tens of thousands of people remain buried under the rubble and their deaths have not been recorded. The report found Israel's military operations are vastly disproportionate to any reasonable military objective and therefore unlawful. The Israeli siege of Gaza has created a famine with hundreds of Palestinians starving to death. The blockade of the Strip has also led to a shortage of medical supplies, leading to Palestinians dying from preventable illnesses and treatable injuries. According to the UN Commission of Inquiry, the Israeli onslaught in Gaza amounts to a genocide. Israeli authorities deliberately inflicted conditions of life on the Palestinians in Gaza calculated to destroy, in whole or in part, the Palestinians in Gaza, which is an underlying act of genocide. The commission also looked into the Israeli policy for the West Bank. The report concludes, Israeli policies and actions implemented since October 2023 in the West Bank demonstrate clear intent to forcibly transfer Palestinians, expand Israeli civilian presence, and annex the entirety of the West Bank, preventing any potential Palestinian self-determination and statehood, and maintaining an indefinite occupation. Land and housing policies impacting Palestinians in Israel are part of the broader policy towards the Palestinian population as a whole, aimed at striving towards a Jewish majority in all areas under Israeli control, reducing the possibility of geographical self-determination for the Palestinian people. And so, this, for everybody listening to the show, I know you guys know Israel's conducting a genocide in Gaza, moving towards annexing the West Bank. We cover it every single episode of this show, often on the Kyle Anzalone show as well. But I do think it's important when these independent UN bodies come out and say it. It definitely gives more ammunition, especially against the people who will say, oh, you're just being anti-Semitic. When you could cite the UN reports, it makes it much harder. Some of them will still do it. The real committed Zionists still will. But I do find these kinds of things help us to sway people who are still swayable. All right. Next up here, Spain imposes total arms embargo on Israel. So in an effort to pressure Israel over the genocide in Gaza, Spain imposed a total arms embargo on Israel and barred imports from West Bank settlements. The Spanish government adopted the measures on Tuesday. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said the goal was to halt the genocide in Gaza. Spain's economic minister explained the decree is a big step towards forward and pioneering at the international level when it comes to a total arms embargo on Israel. Madrid adopted 4 measures limiting trade with Israel. The economic minister explained on his X account, Spain imposed a total embargo on buying and selling arms with Israel, denying the transport of fuels that could have military use, a ban on imports from West Bank settlements, and the prohibition of advertising goods produced in Palestinian-occupied territories. And he wrote on X, today we consolidate the total arms embargo on Israel and the ban on importing products from the occupied territories. We continue leading the pressure on Israeli government in defense of peace, international security, and respect for human rights and humanitarian law. Spain is a small supplier of arms to Israel since October of 2023. Spain has sold about 6.2 million in weapons to Israel. Earlier this month, Madrid canceled its largest contract with Tel Aviv, which was the $825 million sale for rocket launchers. And so that isn't completely inconsequential, but the U.S. is by far Israel's largest supplier of weapons. Presidents Joe Biden and Donald Trump has refused to leverage U.S. military support to Israel to force Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to end the onslaught in Gaza. Madrid is the most vocal government in the West opposing Israel's genocide in Gaza. Last week, Sanchez called for Israel to be barred from international supporting events. And I have mixed feelings about this. I am a big believer in Ron Paul's idea of we always use sports as diplomatic efforts, that these are ways to break down barriers, to move two countries that may be in opposition closer together. In this case, I do understand, like, if you didn't want the Israeli soccer team playing in Spain, if Spain didn't want to allow that, I get it. If the Spanish government is, say, funding some kind of international event, I think there's some kind of European singing contest that for some reason Israel and also other countries like Australia get invited to, but particularly Israel seems like an odd country to have. I think it's called Eurovision. And some of the countries that are main funders of that, I think Spain and Ireland are 2 of them, don't want Israel to be included in that event. And I do think there's arguments there, even though, again, maybe there's more of a diplomatic opportunity by inviting them versus disallowing them. All right. And then Spain is taking other measures too. Spain to join Italy in sending warships to assist a Gaza aid flotilla after Israeli attack. And so we've talked about this. There's this global SMOD flotilla, which is attempting to break the Israeli siege of Gaza. I think initially there was some 52 boats in the flotilla. I believe saw now that number is 37. So, I mean, I'm sure it's not easy to sail on the Mediterranean, and that, these smaller vessels, maybe older vessels, are running into problems and things like that, which dwindled the numbers a little bit. I do believe there's 6 ships that are currently in Greece that do plan to join the coalition, so that will increase the number to 43. Then on Tuesday, Israel carried out an attack on the flotilla ships. Most of the attacks were dropping flashbang grenades from drones, dropping some sort of chemicals or liquids on the boats, not necessarily large explosive armed drones, although I'm sure if you're one of the people being subjected to the flashbangs, it's certainly terrorizing, scary, could cause some more minor injuries, not lethal or anything like that. One of the boats was disabled and likely will not be able to continue. And so it'll be interesting to see how this all develops. But I would not be surprised if Israel does something very provocative against these ships. I don't know if they're going to risk risk blowing up the ships because there are a large number of U.S. veterans on those ships. I believe about 24 in total. I'm not sure how spread out they are. I think 6 or 7 are on one single ship, but maybe they disperse them to discourage Israel, because not that everybody's lives on those ships aren't important, but from the perspective of whose life is Israel less willing to take, if they start killing U.S. veterans, they may upset Donald Trump. It's not guaranteed, but it's certainly possible. And so I'm not sure they're going to try to do anything lethal strikes against these ships, but likely boarding, seizing, arresting the people on these ships, I do think is going to happen. All right, next up here, Trump. Oh, wrong article. 1 second. All right, so we got a couple major updates when it comes to the situation with Iran's nuclear program. First up here, this article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on September 24th. Iranian president says Iran will never seek a nuclear weapon. The Iranian president explained to the UN General Assembly that Tehran has no plans to weaponize the civilian nuclear energy program following Israel's unprovoked war in June. I hereby declare once more before this assembly that Iran has never sought and will never seek to build a nuclear weapon. The one disturbing peace and stability in the region is Israel, but Iran is the one that gets punished. The Islamic Republic has a fatwa against any kind of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. Prior to the war against Iran in June, Tehran's nuclear energy was under strict inspections by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the international nuclear watchdog. Following a massive bombing campaign by Israel and the U.S., Tehran expelled the inspectors. Iran signed an agreement with the IAEA earlier this month to resume inspections. However, Tehran said the implementation of the agreement depended on France, Germany, and UK, or the E3, not reimposing snapback sanctions on Iran. On Friday, the UN Security Council voted to place the snapback sanctions on Iran. The snapback mechanism was implemented by the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Under the agreement, international sanctions on Iran were lifted in exchange for Tehran placing limits on its nuclear energy program. However, the members of the UN Security Council could vote to reimpose the sanctions. During his address to the General Assembly, the Iranian president said the E3 falsely present themselves as parties of good standing to the agreement, and they disparaged Iran's sincere efforts as insufficient. And so again, Iran is saying that we are trying to make a reasonable agreement here with the West, and we just keep getting it thrown back in our face, and they just keep destroying everything. And so it's important to remember, too, that Trump unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. At the time, the IAEA certified that Tehran was in full compliance with the agreement. In response to U.S. sanctions and Israeli assassinations of nuclear scientists, Tehran removed some of the limits on its civilian nuclear program that were imposed by the Iran nuclear deal, or the JCPOA. Israel has an undeclared and uninspected nuclear weapons program. Tel Aviv officially maintains a policy of ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying its nuclear stockpile. Israel is estimated to have between 90 and 400 nuclear warheads. Washington also does not recognize Tel Aviv's nuclear weapons program. The Glenn Amendment requires the U.S. to sanction countries that test or possess nuclear weapons outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Israel is not a party of. If the U.S. recognizes Israel as a nuclear-armed state, it would have to stop sending Israel military aid. The U.S. provides Israel with at least $3.8 billion in annual military assistance. And to make matters worse, Trump continues to demand that Iran completely give up its nuclear enrichment program, and the Iranian supreme leader has said that on those in that situation, there's no point in engaging with talks because we are going to maintain our nuclear program. Last up here, Houthi drone strike injures 22 in Israel. So a drone launched from Yemen exploded in a southern Israeli resort city. Israel's air defenses failed to intercept the UAV. On Wednesday, a drone fired by Ansar Allah hit a hotel in Eilat, which is a southern city in Israel along the Red Sea, injuring 22 people. Most of the injuries were caused by shrapnel. 2 people are in serious condition. The IDF fired 2 Iron Dome interceptors that missed the UAV. Tel Aviv downplayed the risk of future threats from Ansar Allah's drones. The IDF said that the Iron Dome missed the drone because the radar detected the UAV too late. And Israeli Air Force Chief Major General Tomar Bar said there is no new threat here, and there is no reason to stop normal activity in the city. Ansar Allah, or the Houthis, have imposed a blockade of Israeli shipping and attacked Israel to push Tel Aviv to end the genocide in Gaza. The U.S. and Israel have conducted large-scale bombing campaigns in Yemen, but they have failed to prevent the Houthi attacks or break the blockade. An official spokesman from Ansar Allah confirmed the drone was launched from Yemen. The Houthis have ruled most of Yemen since 2015. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel would bomb Yemen in response. Any attack on Israel's cities will be met with harsh and painful blow against the Houthi regime, and has already been proven in the past. The Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, said Yemen would learn the lessons from Gaza. And so I'm sure Israel will bomb Yemen, and this won't change the Houthi resolve, and another drone will land in Israel. More Israeli ships will be stopped in the Red Sea, and the only way to truly end this would be for Israel to stop the genocide, the mass killing in Gaza. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap it up for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I know a lot of you, I got some new Twitter followers. We are just under 10,000. I think like 50 to go. So if you are watching this show and you're not already following me on X, head on over at Kyle Anzalone _ subscribe. I really appreciate it. And I'll be back with the episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show today at 4:45 Eastern.